Capes billowed. The soldiers swallowed their breath. Tightly pursing his lips, the man in black armor glared at the prisoner for a while. Then he finally clicked his tongue and pointed his men away. The soldiers lowered their weapons and loosened their stances, and with flurried steps they took off. The man in the hat disinterestedly waved his finger. His shackles immediately came undone, crashing to the floor. He gingerly picked them up with 2 fingers and tossed them aside. He absentmindedly stared at the ceiling, at the shadows that swayed from the torch's flame. He let out a great yawn, wiped away some tears with a finger, and let out a lonesome sigh. "Percy, Sati, Bell, how's everyone doing these days?" he muttered before tilting his hat back down over his face. As the harvest season neared, the spring-sown wheat gradually took on a golden hue, its ears growing heavier as they danced in the breeze. Belgrieve carefully grabbed one of the stalks, shaking it to check its weight and fullness. He tore off a bit, peeling the husk and letting it rest on his palm. The tightly packed grains were nicely glossy, a fine product once again. He was already beginning to look forward to the harvest. Soon there would be a greater yield in the mountain as well. Wild grapes, cowberries, akebia, mushrooms, and all manner of fruits, nuts, and herbs. With luck, he might find honey as well. He usually entered the forest alone, but the youngsters would often tag along this time of year. Of course, now that those youngsters had picked up the means to fend for themselves, they were starting to venture out on their own accord. The village was hectic with preparations for the fall festival. By the time the cider barrels were full, the wheat would be ready to harvest. Then it would be time to strew wheat for the next season, harvest the legumes, stockpile fuel, and prepare preserved food and livestock feed to sustain them through the winter. It was one event after another with hardly a moment to catch their collective breath. The villagers would give it their all to make the winter more bearable. Belgrieve did not just tend his own crops, but helped in others' fields as well. Duncan did much the same. In his head, he thought through the various stages of work while Mitt waddled over and clung to his leg. Scissors were useless on the boy's long hair, so it had been tied back.
"Dad."
Belgrieve lifted him up. "What's wrong? Where's Grandpa?" he asked.
"Grandpa, there."
Belgrieve turned, his eyes tracing Mitt's gesturing before landing upon Graham and Marguerite, squaring off with wooden swords in hand. Even Marguerite, who typically wielded her sword with arrogance, was visibly anxious to face off against Graham. She had a serious look on her face, maintaining a steady stance as she cautiously waited for an opportunity to strike. The elf master and student had blended right into Turnera. They had no intentions of settling down here, but Graham didn't plan to leave for the time being, not when Mitt was around. Marguerite had evidently come face to face with her own inadequacies. Not only did she beg Graham to retrain her from the ground up, she also headed out to the forest with Belgrieve and the others to learn how to search and explore. She already had some experience in the field, but there was something to be said for gaining a new perspective. The elves saw forests as a place to live, while adventurers saw it as a wilderness to explore. Marguerite seemed quite intrigued by this difference. In the village, she was as rowdy as ever, but though she remained rough and reckless, she would stop to think now and again and go off to wander the grassy plains on her own. Her troubled face as she wandered off, framed by the characteristic comely features of her tribe, made her seem so terribly ephemeral. Meanwhile, Belgrieve was practicing with his sword far less than before. He never missed his morning and evening practice sessions, but he now focused more on breathing and meditation. At 43 years old, training his body was no longer the most direct way to increase his abilities. Training as though he were still a young man could have the opposite effect, and reckless muscle training would only slow his decline. Under Graham's instruction, he had taken a step forward in improving synergy with his blade, as well as in moving mana efficiently through his body. His dynamic style had shifted to a more static one, and while it may have been hard for others to tell, Belgrieve could feel he was definitely changing. How ironic, he thought. Back when he fought as an adventurer, he felt as though he had reached the limit of his ability as a frontline fighter. However, the loss of his leg had forced him to swing his sword in a different way. He would never have bloomed like this otherwise. Belgrieve chuckled as he watched.